Okay, hi everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. This is our first shot at doing a podcast, if you will, and welcome to When Movies Were Good. My name's Rachel, and I've got a co-host here, one of my great friends in life, Matt. We're both from Melbourne, Australia, and we met through a local theatre company, which we still volunteer at, especially Matt does. He's very involved there. And we just got together and talking about our love for old films and just thought, with what's going on in the world, why not get together and do a podcast when we talk about films and when they were good, because we definitely love old films. I'm not too keen on a lot of what comes out of Hollywood at the moment. I'm not too sure how Matt feels about that, but that's something perhaps we can discuss down the line. So the format of our discussions, or podcast, if you like, really will be themed around two films that we pick, the era of films that we want to discuss from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and perhaps early 60s, but we'll see how we go. And the theme will normally be around a director, a period of time, perhaps a cinematographer, actor in a film, a genre, film noir, or any other sort of comedic genres or anything, but all kind of relating to films of that era. So I just wanted to thank Matt for being with me today. And Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks very much, Rachel. Well, like you said, we both met at a theatre company. My background is actually in art and archaeology, so I'm actually a curator by trade. So I suppose I always have had a strong influence in the visual. It's probably more in the last 10 years or so that I've gotten really interested in the moving visuals. So this will be a good angle to push from.
That's fantastic. So, and actually, you have a great interest in theatre as well, which kind of is and as do I, which is a great segue into our first podcast today, where we'll be discussing two films from the great Orson Welles. Orson Welles is quite a very interesting figure in both not only theatre but film as well. I mean, what do you think about his career, Matt?
Well, Orson Welles is such an all-encompassing figure. He really reached world notoriety in radio about 3 years before he entered the film world, particularly because of his broadcast of War of the Worlds. Now, we know these days it's probably generally regarded that the world actually did not believe that aliens were invading. But however the actual result was at the time, it was a magnificent publicity vehicle for Orson, and that really put his talents on stage for the world to see. And so it's quite an all-encompassing variety of mediums he worked in. He worked in film, radio. I don't know if he got as much into television as Hitchcock did. I know he had a few made-to-TV serials. His trouble was that, unlike Hitchcock, he wasn't that very good at a businessman. He didn't get on well with the men in suits.
I had read that, yes. And also he actually, his love for the theatre, I mean, he went off and started his own repertory theatre company, the Mercury Theatre Company, is that correct?
Yes, and his sort of radio production company had a similar thing. And in Citizen Kane, his first film, that was also sort of part of the Mercury family.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot of the actors that he, just from researching the film, they were all from pretty much all very untested cinema actors who were all from his theatre company in New York. Is that right? Or
well, he had a very unprecedentedly powerful contract with Citizen Kane. He that didn't necessarily mean he was financially compensated in any big way, but perhaps in terms of his power, in terms of directing, editing, final cut, it was quite unprecedented. He was this rising power force in the late 30s, and apparently the studios were willing to take a risk with him. It's quite unusual. It was Charlie Chaplin in his time did have a similar all-encompassing authority on all aspects of production, but that was in the silent era when productions were a lot smaller. The studios hadn't taken quite as much of a hold when you needed such a large sets and technology to be monitored over like an army, basically. So it was quite unprecedented how much authority Orson Welles could have given that first film and Citizen Kane, and he never quite had that same authority again. He always had one side. To put it, I think Roger Ebert said Orson Welles can do better than any other director with one hand tied behind his back. The trouble is that he always has both hands tied behind his back by one executive or another.
That's right, because he was his way of making films was quite well, I guess he'd come from the stage, and his perception of making films was quite a bit different from a lot of the established film actors that were working in the industry at the time. So let's start with the first film that we're going to discuss today, which is by a lot of commentators considered the greatest, if not one of the greatest films ever made. And perhaps it was just the era that it was made. It was the avant-garde sort of techniques that he used in this film. Citizen Kane was made in 1941. And Orson Welles was its producer, co-writer, director and star. And this was his first feature film, and it was nominated for Academy Awards in 9 categories. So a lot of critics, as we just said, filmmakers, believe that this film is one of the greatest ever made. And it's a sort of quasi-biographical film. There was a few major sort of media players that sort of took umbrage to this film, like William Randolph Hearst, was it, and Joseph Pulitzer, who were 2 big newspaper magnates, because the film is an investigation of the main character, Charles Foster Kane, who's played by Orson Welles. His dying words reveal conflicting stories from his scandalous life. And it's sort of a film that jumps back and forth in this character's life, but we do see him on his deathbed at the start. So Matt, what's your take on the story in Citizen Kane?
Well, it's interesting looking at that film because I actually only saw it for the second time in my life quite recently. The first time I saw it was when I was a teenager. At that time, I hadn't even sort of known its reputation as supposedly the greatest film in the world. I liked black and white films, and I think that was how I think my mum saw a copy in the discount bin or something and gave it to me one time when she was, because she knew I liked black and white films. And so I saw it, and I didn't have that preconceived notion, if you were going to film school, that you might otherwise have. And so I did find the story to be very powerful. Now, I didn't know anything about the technological innovations at the time, and really any sort of visual or technological innovations should play a supportive role to the storyline generally. And yes. I found the story of this great figure who had sort of had that fundamental aspect of his family home taken away from him at a young age, and he had to sort of deal with this unprecedented wealth and sort of finding a meaning for himself. I found the story quite powerful, and like when you're 16 and the like, stories like that sort of resonate with how you want to sort of approach the world. What didn't occur to me at the time was that this was actually it, even though it has that sort of all-encompassing, wisely old age vibe to it. This was made by Orson Welles when he was only 27, or something like that. I think it was or 25 actually. Sorry, it was a young film. It was a young director, full of energy. He was not trying to capstone his life to have a magnum opus. Nobody, in general, I think most who do try to create a great all-encompassing magnum opus tend to be the ones that create the flops. He created a storyline And in his case, it was his background in theater which helped probably some of the innovations he made. Uh, Sometimes it doesn't work. In his case, it did, because one of the major innovations was that they used a deep focus. So that means that for the most of the film, the majority of the picture was completely, that you see on the screen, is completely in focus. That meant he could do all sorts of play with in-depth layering of the picture, so going through great corridors. Or there's that famous scene where the childhood Kane is playing in the snow outside while his parents are talking with a lawyer in their house, and they have both sections of the picture playing out against each other, uh, which would have been hard if you were only focusing on one element. And in a nutshell, it's actually quite fascinating when you go into the technical terms. But essentially, you needed a huge amount of light to be able to create that full depth of field. Because to create a depth of field, you need to have effectively the iris of the camera closed a lot tighter, and so it means distributing the light evenly throughout the space can be quite difficult. This is quite often why a lot of filmmakers cheat. They mainly have a very narrow focus near to where the camera is, move it for another spot, cross-editing through. Orson Welles loved his long takes, especially later when he had a lot of interference from studios who wanted to edit his films afterwards. He would learn to use that method a lot more, because it meant that if you have a long take, it's harder for them to get away with cutting up the story without it no longer making sense.
Yes, that's true.
But the thing with Citizen Kane is that it is not purely Orson Welles' own innovation. He had a great deal of help from a cinematographer at the time, Greg Toland. Now, Orson Welles was interviewed about Citizen Kane over and over for decades. It's a real tragedy that I think not even I think Greg Toland, the cinematographer, had already died within 5 years of that film. So it's a great tragedy that we sort of don't get to hear both their stories with it. But Orson, he had the vision, the sort of the theatrical vision, the lighting vision, and what he didn't realize for the first few weeks of production was that actually behind the scenes, when they were setting up the lighting and he was describing his vision, not necessarily knowing how that translates to the camera a lot of the time, Greg Toland was actually in the background, basically secretly telling everybody how to actually achieve what he was wanting.
Yes.
And when it was revealed a few weeks later, he sort of took Orson aside for a weekend and taught him most of the technical aspects you need to know about a camera. So Greg Toland was obviously one of these craftsmen who was willing to share a creative vision, to engage in a creative dialogue. He wasn't hoarding the technical secrets, claiming it would take years to learn. He freely admitted that most of the operations of a camera you could learn in a weekend, and he was willing to help Orson achieve his vision.
Well, I think with most films, I mean, the director can often take a lion's share of the credit, but it's often all the other little things that everyone does on the film that it's definitely a team effort. I don't think there's any film out there, unless the person's doing every single thing on their own, a successful film that was just down to one person. It's often just a lot of the right people there at the right time. I mean, I actually didn't realize, but Bernard Herrmann, this was his first music score for a film that he did. At least my research said that. And obviously we know him for all of the great scores that he did for Alfred Hitchcock, including one of the most famous, Psycho in 1960, but also North by Northwest. But I mean, just the list goes on. And I didn't actually realize this was his first film scoring. So basically, you know, Citizen Kane is this sort of sweeping film about this man who, you know, builds himself up and becomes a media magnate. But it finishes, you know, with him on his, well, it starts and sort of finishes in the same spot. What do you think about the symbolism in this film? There is, if we allude to that symbolism of Rosebud, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So now, one tongue-in-cheek thing I have heard, it's obviously a bit hard to confirm, but one of the claims is that it was actually a reference to a pet name for the newspaper magnate that Charles Foster Kane was allegedly based on. The nickname he had for his partner's tender region.
I did not know that. So this
Well,
was
that's
his
one.
tongue-in-cheek way of getting it into the film, was it?
Well, it's one claim, and certainly I'd be ticked off, and probably that's one of the reasons he tried more than anything to suppress the release of the film. Um,
Yes.
uh, but I think a big part of it is the symbolism is, of course, a reference to childhood home, and it's perhaps a concept which is a little more foreign to maybe a lot of younger generations, particularly raised in suburbs that are uh, reproducible. They all look alike. I remember when I was studying German and we had to constantly study this concept called Heimat, which was rather difficult to translate into English, and maybe generations back then understood it a bit more, but also was sort of searching for this maternal love, the family home that he lost. What I thought was rather unusual about the film is that we see, sorry, spoilers, but we see Olsen's mother. She gave him up to the lawyers and the banker, believing he'd have a better life. We know that she was probably trying to help him escape a violent father.
Yes.
Who was more ticked off about losing his share of a fortune because of a legal technicality. And but then the only other reference we have to her part playing in the narrative is when he's in middle age and she's died, and her possessions are in a warehouse somewhere. And so I think that's quite unusual in that we don't really know what part, if any, she played in Orson's life until then. Like, did he only find out she died through a letter from a lawyer? Did he make any contact with her afterwards? Was there concern on either side about how each other played in their upbringing? Um, so it's a lot of questions, and you can understand how Charles Foster Kane would be searching for that attention, and like he's always searching for attention. I mean, he's this flamboyant character. Uh, it's sort of a like in the time it was a very different world when I first saw that film when I was 16. But since then we have all these very flamboyant people like the Kardashians and stuff that live their life on an open stage, even though they probably have had a well, at least they've had their parents around for most of their life. They weren't torn at childhood, but certainly this cross between some. Well, personally, I don't see the Kardashians talking for the working person so much, but then Charles Foster Kane, it's very much a yes, I'll support everyone, but they've got to love me in return. It's a very self-centered way of approaching the world.
Yeah, I suppose what I got out of it, I'm more of a fan of a film that just starts somewhere and finishes somewhere. So his narrative structure in the film perhaps is not my cup of tea. While I am appreciative of it, I just prefer a film that kind of starts somewhere and finishes somewhere. I'm rarely highly engaged by films that sort of jump around and have different people coming in and out. Not that there's no value in films like that, but for me, it's just not naturally what I enjoy without having to think too much about it. But I guess for
So
me,
you
I
think
suppose.
so you think it didn't finish somewhere like you'd like it to?
No, it sort of started and finished somewhere. That aspect, it was the way it got there in between, I think. I
Yeah.
guess for me, I just prefer a character start somewhere and they finish somewhere. But that's just a personal thing to me. That doesn't mean any film that uses a different narrative structure or anything is wrong or anything like that. It's just in terms of me sitting down and watching a film, I just like to go on that journey with the character. If I find there's too many flashbacks or other things happening, for me, not in all cases, I guess it depends on the film, but I suppose I do like the symbolism in this film. I am always drawn back to one of the great miniseries that I watched during the 1980s. I'm a bit older than Matt, so I remember the 1980s quite well. And it was about a character who was very similar to Charles Foster Kane, and he was at the end of his life and all these tragedies had befallen him, and he had these massive amounts of money and no family, and he looked at the one person he still had in his life and he said, you might as well take the whole house, take everything. And she goes, I don't need anything from this house. And he said, why not? And she said, this house has taught me everything I could learn. And he said, what's that? It was actually Hugo Weaving who was playing this character. And she said that possessions are meaningless. And I've never forgotten that to that day, because you can have all the possessions, all the wealth, everything in the world. And I think this film, there is a little bit, I mean, Rosebud was the sleigh that he was playing on as a child. And I guess that's taken him back to a simpler time when he was sort of genuinely happy in his life, I suppose. So perhaps that's kind of an easy way of maybe putting some kind of moral thing onto this film, is that, you know, possessions and having wealth and status, you know, can't trade for the genuinely happy times that you have in your life, as simple as something as playing on a sleigh when you were a child, I suppose. So
yeah, well, I suppose to me, a philosophy is that productiveness, sort of meaningful productiveness, is happiness in a big way. And yes, I am a fan of Mark Manson's The Secret Art of Not Giving a Beep. I think that's a good. But it's interesting the way that Wells, his actual life, how that would sort of correlate in an opposition way to some of the successes and failures of Charles Foster Kane, because Kane has all this wealth but sort of no gold to go around, whereas Orson Welles was a prolific independent creative. He just struggled financially to keep up with his projects. And there is one interview where allegedly he claimed that he wanted to buy the rights of RKO from RKO at the time to have control of Citizen Kane. He'd be able to sort of release it himself and be independently wealthy. And like, would that have solved all his problems in that he would have just had the means to fund his projects? I don't know. Maybe he would have been able to help finish those projects. Although I think he also struggled with them mentally. Some of the later projects, especially, for example, the one that he never finished, that Netflix has just done an interpretation of.
What's the name of that?
It was
That's okay. We'll have to look it up. So Netflix is doing it.
It's the age of internet. You don't need to know names. A film that Orson Welles didn't finish, and you'll know what it's been talked about.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Well, so this film was shot over 10 weeks. It was shot at Paramount Studios in Hollywood, and some other people who we would know in this film, Joseph Cotton, who was quite well known to moviegoers of the time. He especially did some really good Alfred Hitchcock films. Agnes Moorehead, I remember her from Bewitched. Is that right? Is that the same Agnes Moorehead?
Yes, that's exactly the same. It's kind of difficult to imagine going from sort of the how shall I put it? When many people are used to seeing her as the first colorful cougar, and instead seeing her as this very austere Coloradan housewife person with the dark hair. Mind you, she was apparently quite a keen biblical student throughout her life, so probably that would have been an identity that would have suited her, sort of that austere Midwest lady focused on the important things of life. and
Yeah, it
protecting
was just,
her
yeah, it
son.
was interesting that she was in this film. And but before we move on to the other Orson Welles film, there was somebody else had co-written this film or had given a lot of notes for this film, and I'm going to probably say his name wrong. It was Herman Mankiewicz, but Orson Welles went through and changed the script quite a lot, so he primarily got the credit. And they've done studies about it, I think, and it was primarily Orson Welles's work. So I guess it was his baby. It was the one he wanted to make, and I mean, for a first film, I mean, wow. So I did like the film. Um, it's probably not the most natural watch for me. What about you? What's your final thoughts on it?
Okay, as far as the writing of the storyline itself, I know very little myself, but as far as I can certainly imagine Wells would have taken a dominant hand in the storyline, but more importantly is the visual the visual power that he introduced. So he'd proved himself in radio, and he introduced a lot of the sound innovations to Citizen Kane as well. The way you have sort of naturally competing voices. It's not always. It's not like for example, a Shakespeare play where you have one clear line going from the other. There's like overlapping fighting of speech, and a voice comes out. It's quite theatrical in that sense. He'd already mastered a lot of the sort of early film noir lighting and the stage. Uh, he did manage to achieve a lot through projects that were partially funded through the New Deal. So he had a lot of
Yes.
opportunities. He really came at the best time. Uh, uh, a talented theater who and his country basically said, we need to employ people, come up with projects to do so, and he did. Um, but I think it's too hard it's too hard a claim to make for any film, painting, or piece of music that is the greatest ever made. Um, if you approach it as a story, it's I think it's something that can really resonate at any time. It's like Elgar's cello concerto. It's was for years associated with this older man at the end of life mourning over World War One, creating this melancholy piece. But then Jacqueline Dupre, the very young blonde English cellist, played such a heartfelt rendition of it. It's so it was something that could really resonate across all the generations, and it feels so fresh today, even.
Yeah, it does. So we're going to briefly go over and have a look at another film that he made from this period of time. Although he'd had a break from what I was reading, Orson Welles went over and he went back to the theatre and back to radio. So he made The Stranger. 1945, I think it was shot, released in 46. So The Stranger is a film noir drama about a war crimes investigator who tracks a high-ranking Nazi fugitive to an idyllic New England town. And this really is film noir, isn't it? Just from the get-go it is. So it has Edward G. Robinson in it, Loretta Young, and Orson Welles is the third lead, playing the fugitive Franz Kindler, aka Professor Charles Rankin. So this film was shot at Universal Studios. Orson Welles was married to Rita Hayworth at the time. Unlike Citizen Kane, this film was a box office success straight away, and it often gets compared to the great Alfred Hitchcock film Shadow of a Doubt, which starred Joseph Cotten, who worked with Wells in Citizen Kane. So, what's your thoughts on this film, Matt? What do you like about the story, and what do you think about the actors in the film?
Well, I think the comparison with Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt is absolutely spot on, because the huge nucleus, like Shadow of a Doubt, is that you have this idyllic, quiet, supposedly perfect American town. I mean, we've known all the social analysis since then in the 60s and so forth, but we won't go into that for now. But in both films, you have this idyllic town, and you suddenly have this dark force come in. This one individual that sort of corrupts, but shows its shows its weaknesses and is doing his best to hide in plain view. In the case of this one, it is a Nazi hiding out amongst the birthplace of America's future sons, or whatever the term was back then.
Yeah, it was a
And
very idyllic place, and yeah, very high
yeah,
respected
and I
people
think
lived in those areas.
I think that's how New Haven still views itself now. Um,
Yes.
in the case of Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, that's a much more abstract one where you have another West Coast town, Santa Barbara, I think it is, and you have this supposedly perfect American new city, all the good American values, and suddenly this dark force brought in by a in the form of Joseph Cotton, brought in by a steam train with belching black smoke, and he gradually shows his corrupt side. We know that he's a killer. We know that he despises wealthy widows who have apparently made their husbands work to death so they can reap their inheritance. But I suppose that's a very rich film in its own, and that certainly would be worth another podcast in itself.
Yeah, definitely. So this was his third feature film, Orson Welles. There is symbolism in this film as well, with the hobby clock that he has, and also the clock in the town. What's your opinion on how he shot this film? Do you think it was as stylistic as his first go out with Citizen Kane? A lot of people thought it was a bit more sort of formulaic, but I guess a lot more films in the noir genre were being made at that time anyway. So.
Well, as I recall, Wells did make it in a rather hurried fashion, and it is quite tightly edited. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's quite clean, and he's already beginning some of the long long takes, which he'd become known for, especially in Touch of Evil. I love the part where he's killed. Well, even before that, where another former Nazi who's escaped, or he's been allowed to escape, so he can lead the authorities to Wells in the small town, and Wells lures him into a wood, strangles him, and then hides the body, all the time anticipating some schoolboys to come chasing up that he knows are going to be arriving later, and that beautiful long take where he's hiding the body and the camera swerves over it. It's a very visually powerful motive. It really draws you in. As far as symbols, definitely it's not as it's far more narrative driven than Citizen Kane, though. It's much more like the sort of the Pulp Fiction of the Maltese Falcon and
Yes.
the like.
Yes, I do agree with that. I'm still kind of getting into that particular genre of film, so I'm not too familiar with some of the other ones. But when I was looking through the catalogue of film noir, I mean, I'm very familiar with all of the names that were coming up. So I'm looking to definitely explore that a lot more. This film for me was probably a better watch. I did enjoy certain sequences, the sequence you referenced when Orson Welles' character killed off the person who could blow his cover, and some of the high tension sequences with Loretta Young. I thought she was very good, and I really liked Edward G. Robinson in this film. I don't think from what I was reading, he wanted a woman to actually play the role that Edward G. Robinson was playing. I don't know if it was Agnes Moorehead, but it was somebody along that line, but the studio said no. And you're right, he was under a lot of pressure to bring this film in under budget and in a timely manner. And he did do that, and it was a box office success. So for me, I enjoyed The Stranger a bit more than Citizen Kane. It just had a bit more of the elements in it that a bit more of the thriller style elements in it that I'm sort of interested in. What was your sort of lasting impression of it?
Well, I think I saw The Stranger about 3 times in very rapid succession, so I loved it very much. It has so much. There's so much visual uh, visual excellence that you just can't stop looking at it. When the scenes in the clock tower, and like I do love my old grandfather clocks,
Yes.
and all the gear movements, the dark shadows, the even the some of the sky views. It's very very entrenching.
Would you
And
pick one over the other, or it doesn't, not necessarily? Like to watch, if you had to sort of sit down and choose one to watch, would you, or both are equally good?
I think both are equally good. It's I think the look, I'll be controversial. I'll say I think The Stranger has as much visual merit as Citizen Kane, but the storyline of The Stranger is much more suspense driven.
Yes,
Uh,
I agree.
but it's also aged superbly. Now I don't know if it's simply because in 1946, of course, chasing down Nazis was a very new thing, and like you can tell even when they're discussing some of the crimes he was supposed to have done, that they didn't even have quite a clear idea of everything that went on in the death camps. Uh,
Yes.
like there's uh, like a discussion about how the showers were used and everything. So obviously they were still investigating all the methods that were used, but it's a storyline that's continued well in that we know how people will try and hide out in plain view. Um,
Well, that still
even though,
happens today, so
yeah,
mm.
these days though probably most Nazi fugitives probably aren't as difficult to chase though.
Yeah.
They probably just need to
Yes,
let
that's
the
true.
air out of their oxygen cylinder.
Yes, like there's not too many of them around now, thank God for that. But
Would be
well, look,
justice
that
if you
was
let the air out of the cylinder.
yeah. Well, thank you, Matt. That was a great. So we did, these films are definitely worth a watch. All classic films are. All of them have merit in some way, shape, or form, whether it's an actor that you like, a director, the story, the way the film was shot. I suppose that's why I asked Matt to do this podcast / discussion with me on a regular basis, because I really just got sick of what I was seeing contemporary Hollywood bring out. I can barely get through a modern film from Hollywood. So I still like Australian films. I still like a lot of English films. There's some foreign language films that I've seen recently that were good, but the stuff coming out of Hollywood, it's just nothing like anything that they used to produce. Where all the films were pretty good. And is there anything you'd like to say before we sign off, Matt? Or
Oh, I suppose it's just I think we could almost have eventually a second stream of podcasts where it's kind of like the second classic period, sort of from 1960 to 1990. But
that's
I
true.
think yes, Hollywood is very different, and like you can tell often when looking at even modern films set in a previous age, that it tells much more about the era of the people that are making the film than when it's set. It's I think the modern era, we have too much uh, we give ourselves sometimes more credit than we deserve, thinking that everything is right now and not back then. It's a much more ambiguous journey to look through. So I think we'll have a lot of food for thought in coming episodes. And even if we are primarily focused up to, like you said, to about 1960, I think we'll see a whole extra way of thinking. Hopefully, listeners will be inspired to explore this rich period, and I look forward to having the excuse to watching all the movies.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Matt. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to many more collaborations. And thanks to everyone who gave us a chance and listened to our probably slightly rough first go at doing this, but it's all good because we're learning as we go along. And we really thank you for listening. And we hope you'll check back in with us again on the next episode. So thank you from Rachel, and
Matthew, thanks for having us.
thank you. Take care. Bye.